You're listening to Tonebenders, the Sound Designers Podcast. Let's do this.
Welcome to Tonebenders. My name is Renee Coronado, and with me as always, it's Tim Muirhead. Hey Tim, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good today. The sun is out and it's shining, and I actually had my lunch out on my front porch in the sunset. It was super cold, but at least there was sun, so I'm feeling pretty good today.
We had an ice storm, and then we had a 70-degree day, and then we had a hailstorm, and now it's 80 degrees again. Weather's nutty, but one place where weather is always nutty is in the deserts. We've got a desert recording roundtable together for us today. It's a really stacked lineup, so tell us who we got.
Yeah, we've got a list of great guests today. First off, we have Bethan Kellough, a sound artist and composer. She specializes in creating immersive sound worlds, drawing from environmental sound and field recordings. She had a debut album released on Touch Records that was listed in Rolling Stone's 20 Best Avant Albums of the Year. That's pretty cool. Welcome to the show, Bethan.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. Also, we have Zach Goheen. Zach was previously on Tonebenders for episode 111, talking about his amazing work on Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He recently released an amazing, I think I used amazing twice in this intro, amazing sound library called Dune Drones, featuring singing sand dunes recorded in the Death Valley National Park. Glad to have you back, Zach.
Thanks for having me.
And then we have two of our returning champions, Thomas Rex Beverly. He's an avid nature recordist, and he runs the highly regarded sound effects library that bears his name. From angry chipmunks to the Alaskan wilds, Thomas has recorded just about every natural setting North America has to offer. It's great to have you back, Thomas.
Thanks for having me on.
And finally, we have George Vlad. George is a globe-traveling recordist that has captured the sounds in jungles, volcanoes, cloud forests, and deserts. His recordings are available via his Mindful Audio sound effects label. Welcome to the show, George.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So you can head to tonebenderspodcast.com, find the episode page for this episode, and you can find links on how you can find all the libraries that these people have and their homepages and such. Both Thomas and George were previously on our podcast in episode 121, where they talked about their experiences and their lessons learned recording rain out in the field. We thought it would be good to invite them back and open it up to Zach and Bethan to talk about the near opposite recording conditions, capturing the sound of the dry, arid conditions in a desert. So let's get our bona fides out of the way. Let's talk about what experience you all have recording in deserts. Let's start with you, Thomas.
For me, a lot of it started, I grew up in the San Antonio area, and so I used to spend a lot of time going out into the deserts in West Texas. And there's some mountains out there that are about a mile up, and so you get a lot of conditions that are pretty similar to a lot of New Mexico and Utah, and you get these kind of really nice high desert mountains, a lot of time in Big Bend National Park out there. And so, yeah, a lot of that growing up. And then what really got me interested in recording in deserts was I did a long distance bicycle ride across the country about 5 years ago, where I rode a bicycle from San Diego, California to about El Paso, Texas, for about 1,000 miles. And I was just carrying a Zoom H6 with me at the time, but it was my first real kind of big field recording adventure, and I had all my stuff with me, and I was trying to do time-lapse photography and just recording a bunch of firsts with things. First kind of dawn chorus, first time recording wind in the wires and like doing all sorts of stuff. And yeah, just trying to ride a bike 50 to 70 miles and 75 miles a day or something, and doing a lot of that. So I've always really loved big, open, sparse soundscapes. And then my parents retired out into West Texas, and they lived in a little adobe house in the mountains out there. And so that became kind of the home base for a lot of my field recording adventures over the last 7 or 8 years ago, and did a whole bunch of recording out there. And then more recently have been exploring around Colorado and Utah in the last few months, and doing some kind of extreme cold weather desert stuff as well as the summertime stuff. So that's kind of an overview.
Cool. Bethan, you've recorded in the Chilean desert, is that true?
Yeah, I was sent in 2018 to the Atacama Desert to make some recordings for the New York Times Listen to the World issue of their Voyages magazine. Yeah, so I went there to make some recordings specifically of the sounds of the rocks sort of heating up and cooling down. They make this sort of clicking, cracking sound as they do that. which is quite incredible. And yeah, that was an amazing experience. Other than that, I've recorded a lot in the Californian deserts, sort of the Colorado Desert, Mojave Desert, and recently the area of the Sonoran Desert that's sort of on the border between California and Arizona.
That's great.
Cool. Zach, what desert recordings have you done?
I've just been doing desert recordings in a limited scope in the Southern California area. I think I got into it about 2012. I did a big kind of hiking trip where I borrowed my mother's car and drove all over the American West and did a bunch of hiking in the Escalante region of southern Utah, all around Idaho, did a lot of camping. But it's kind of the first time I did a lot of like slot canyon hiking before. And it was an eye-opening experience and an ear-opening experience, and just hearing the kind of, close reflections and the barrenness, but also the real fragile ecosystems that are involved with those landscapes was really a first for me. I grew up in the Midwest where it's just wind and trees. So after that, I ended up moving out to California a year later and took that opportunity to just buy a more capable vehicle for going out into the desert, and did that a lot more. So I go up to Death Valley a lot, or I had gone up to Death Valley a lot, and Mojave, Joshua Tree, Anza Borrego, some high deserts in New Mexico. Yeah, just sticking around the greater LA area, but going out to the deserts around here.
And then George, we've got North America, South America covered. Let's head over to where you've recorded. Tell us a bit about your desert recording.
Right. Deserts have been on my mind for a long time. Ever since I went to Africa the first time in 2016, I'd been dreaming about going to the Sahara and to the Namib and to the Kalahari. And I managed to go to the Sahel in 2017 on my trip to Senegal. There's a bit of desert there on the border with Mauritania, and it's not 100% just sand dunes. There's some vegetation as well, but I could escape some of the more green parts of it, and I'd be between the dunes and I'd still hear sound. So I was expecting it to be just barren there. I thought there would be no sound at all. There were the occasional bird and insects, and obviously the wind and sand and everything. And I had hydrophones with me back then as well, and I did some sound recording with the hydrophones in the sand. And it was fascinating. It was another world for me. And going back to why I started Mindful Audio many years ago, I just wanted to listen to these sounds that are often overlooked. And that was the definition of what I wanted to do, basically, being in the desert, listening to these minute sounds. And last year, I managed to go to Namibia for 18 days, self-drive, just being out in the desert. I went to the Kalahari. Unfortunately, it rained for most of the part of the trip in the Kalahari there, which doesn't really happen that often, as you'd expect. But in the Namib, I managed to be out, to be off the grid, self-sustained for 2 or 3 days at a time without any connection to the outside world, and just surrounded by sand and by rocks and by the occasional wildlife. And it was fascinating. I really loved it. And I look forward to going back to a desert, hopefully soon.
There's different kinds of deserts. The Namibian desert is obviously going to be very different from a West Texas desert. As we're all observing deserts, so I've done recordings out in West Texas as well, Thomas. One of my favorite recordings I ever made was out by the cotton fields out in West Texas, because there's all these rows of dirt that they've plowed up for the cotton, and it creates this perfect, almost harmonica that the wind blows over and it just whistles on top of. It's the coolest thing, but that's just a very, very different thing probably, George, from what you experienced out in Namibia.
Well, Namibia was definitely a mix of things. There was a lot of sandy desert, obviously, sand dunes. There's rocky desert, and there was huge, endless gravel fields, also known as desert pavement. And it's basically an endless expanse of gravel and there is a lot of life happening there. There's a lot of very primitive types of plants and mosses and lichens, and there's also insects, and then feeding on those there's lizards and geckos, and then there's birds. And it's this very complex ecosystem that at first glance when you land there, it seems like it's not there. It just takes a while to get used to let your mind and ears to get accustomed to.
Zach, you were talking about ecosystems also that were new to you as you came into deserts. Like, as you're observing those, what were you finding?
Deserts were not part of how I grew up. I grew up in a more Midwestern landscape, and moving out to the West Coast, I had a chance to just discover more time in the mountains and more time in the desert, and understanding the relation between the two of them. You drive up 395 along the eastern side of the Sierras, and you look out your left side as you're going north, and you see the tallest mountain in, the contiguous 48 states on your left, and on your right you see Death Valley, which has the lowest elevation in the United States as well. So they're very close to each other, and they're because of each other. It's the same thing. You drive in Colorado and you see the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and it's like you've got this flat desert landscape, and then out of nowhere you've got these huge mountains that just get a plop in the middle of the landscape. And at the base of those mountains are sand dunes, and you get in the middle of those sand dunes and it's like you're on a set from Star Wars. It's wild. It's a very crazy feeling to just be like, this is here. And the reason it's there is because all of the wind comes across those plains and picks up all of that sand, and as the wind starts to climb up the mountain, it just dumps the sand right there at the base of the mountain. So it's all interrelated and interconnected. And, I'm not a expert in biology or knowing animals and plant species by any means. I try to keep up and try to follow along as I'm out there and try to discover and look it up when I get back home. But just hearing birds I'd never heard before. To this day, the canyon wren is my favorite bird.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I had never heard a canyon wren before until I was out in Utah.
Pew, 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 pew. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like such a signature sound. And now when I'm cutting sounds for films, it's like the sound that means something. It's not just a tweety bird, as a lot of editors will put a Tweety bird in there. No, like the canyon wren means you're in the desert. It means something beautiful and something wonderful. It has a kind of song to it. So you get yourself out there, you open your ears, and you can hear the depth of field a lot more in the desert. There's less noise, there's less signal happening out there in general. So your ears can go deeper into the landscape, and you can hear the critters on the ground hundreds of yards away. So that's what's really special to me, is what seems like a barren landscape really turns out to be very alive. You just have to pay attention and be patient and just listen for it. So,
Bethan, when you went out there, one of your assignments was to go catch the rocks as they're changing position almost. Like, how do you approach that type of assignment? Like, how do you even gain experience, like listening to rocks?
Yeah, so we were there with the photographer Thierry Cohen, who had actually suggested this location, which helped because he'd heard it before. But even with that, we were out in the Kari Valley where he'd heard it before, and we were listening and listening and listening, and it's an incredibly quiet place, and there was not much sound at all for a long time. I have long recordings of the microphones placed up next to various rock faces with really very little happening. But there are certain areas where it's really loud. It's incredible when you sort of contrast it with the rest of the environment being so quiet. It's a little bit like when you go to a concert in a hall and there's the sort of silence, when it goes dark, and then, a sort of, an acoustic musician takes the stage, and the moment they start to play, there's this kind of, it just captures you, the sound out of the quiet. And really this sound had the same effect in this kind of huge area of the valley that was just probably the quietest place I've ever heard, in that the sound it didn't come back at you from the rocks. Like everything was absorbed. I felt like, when I spoke, I felt like the ground was just absorbing my voice. And it's probably to do with because it's the salt in the rocks, and that's actually part of what causes this cracking sound. But yeah, it's just really incredible just to hear this.
Does it happen at a certain time of day, like in the morning and at night when the sun has just risen or set or something?
Yeah, it's due to the changes in temperature. It was later in the morning than we expected. So it really did take time to actually heat up to the temperature. So it was more like 11 a.m., I think, that it got sort of more prominent.
That sounds so cool.
But at sundown, when I recorded it, it was actually just as the sun was setting. That was a little more complicated in that location for the sunset, because that also produced the wind. So, it's really nice to hear that, but when you're, trying to not get, other sounds coming in, then it helps just to kind of have this pristine silence around it rather than the wind.
Wind is a big issue in deserts. And it seems like once you get over a certain velocity, just a regular blimp isn't going to help you. You need some sort of wind protection, which there's, some sort of shearing mechanism to stop wind in its entirety. And there's just less of that in the desert. So as you all approach the wind situation, how do you handle that in a desert setting?
I've done it personally with a few tricks that I've seen used elsewhere by other people and kind of created my own. But it's basically just creating an external blimp around the microphones using your tripod. So you use your tripod like a teepee, wrap the tripod in something. When I've done it before, I've gone out there unprepared. In Death Valley, I was on this section of kind of salt flat riverbed called the Racetrack up there, and where the wind just pulls. And I didn't have anything with me except for clothing. So I just wrapped it with t-shirts or like a large sweatshirt. I think it's just a large t-shirt around there. But coming back, learned the lesson, did some research, and ended up buying reticulated foam. Is that how you say it? Reticulated foam, which is a very porous foam. And it's, you get a 1-inch roll of that. And that's been very successful in further trips up to Death Valley, where you're up in the canyons and the wind just is really pulling. You got to have some extra protection from that. So the reticulated foam wrapped around the tripod within the mics inside their own blimp. So it's like a double layer there. I'd love to hear what other tricks there are, though, because it's always a beast.
Yeah, I've done some stuff similar to what you said, Zach, with the wrapping the whole blimp around using the reticulated foam. Sometimes I'll double or triple up on the blimp. I'll have different size furries, so I've wrapped 2 furries on top. Sometimes I'll put an extra smaller kind of cover inside the blimp. The most effective thing is usually just finding a natural windbreak of some sorts. I've been in a lot of deserts where you can find a fallen tree or an actual tree or just some kind of foliage that'll dampen it a little bit. If you're in sand dunes, just trying to get behind, not on the windward side of the dune, and trying to get the dune to be a windbreak for you. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll get a snowstorm in the desert. And I've had some really good luck with taking an avalanche shovel with me for various reasons, but you can actually build a wind wall out of the snow. And that works really well in the windward direction. And so you can build that up 2 or 3 feet high, because generally I don't want to do that with, it depends on the kind of environment. Some kind of desert environments are really fragile, and I wouldn't want to be building a big sand pile or something because it messes with the environment. But the snow, I'm fine with piling that up because it's going to melt anyway. So I'll build a wall out of the snow. That works really well. And then if you want to take it to the next level, you can actually sort of build a parabolic dish out of the snow, and you can make a kind of 6-foot dish away from a sound source that you don't want. So occasionally I'll have like a really point source thing maybe it's the wind coming through this one saddle in a valley or a distant creek or something, and you can build this parabolic dish out of snow, and it really helps mitigate sound below about 2,000 hertz when you build the dish away from the thing. So that doubles as a wind wall and can kind of focus the sound of the environment a little bit. And then I do quite a bit of wind recording with the mic handheld, because being able to kind of move with the gusts of the wind, I find is much better than trying to do it from a tripod a lot of the time.
And you can use your body as a windbreak too.
Yeah, I use my body. Like I've recorded in 50, 60, 70 mile an hour winds. And if you try to do that on a tripod, it just shakes the tripod and then you get the vibration from the tripod. And so if I'm going out in that, I will use, first I'll start with mics that do a little better in the wind, like an Omni or something generally. Or I like my MKH50 and 30 and MS in the wind, because they don't get as much of the low buffeting as the 8040s that I like to use. And I also like MS in the wind because you can point it straight into the wind, and that helps mitigate the gust hitting it. And then I just like having it handheld because I can kind of dampen the wind gusts a little bit with my hand as I'm out in the wind. So I'm standing on the ridge top and I'm kind of leaning into the wind that's 50 or 60 miles an hour. And then I have some sort of half-baked wind wall or some kind of windbreak that I've made up. Maybe it's a trunk of a tree or it's just some rocks. Another fun thing is if you build a rock cairn. So you just take a whole bunch of the rocks from the environment, build yourself up a little cone of rocks. A lot of times on desert trails, you'll have them already because they use them as trail markers, and they have a really cool filtering effect. So you get the mics right behind the rock cairn, and then the wind will come through that and it slows it down. And then it also kind of filters it in cool ways, and you'll get these interesting kind of whistles and stuff. So
it reminds me of like driving with a cup of coffee. Like it's less likely to spill than if it's in the cup holder. So I like that idea of hand holding. I've never thought of that before.
Yeah, it works. It works a lot better in really high winds. If you're gonna, blimps are normally fine for 10 or 15 miles an hour, depending on the mics and stuff too. Yeah, I guess in deserts you're generally always going to have the wind breaks. If you're in a forest or something, it's going to be canopy wind, and so the wind's not going to hit the blimp as much. But yeah, George, I know you have lots of good tricks too.
Well, on my trip to Namibia, I didn't really try to affect the environment as much. For one, as you said, some of these places are very sensitive, very delicate. So if I went ahead and dug some holes or moved things around or did anything to affect it, it wouldn't have been a good idea, let's say. So I mostly looked for places that were sheltered from the wind. I would record at the bottom of a dune, not on the windward side, as you said, and I would put a pair of MKH 8020s in Rycote WS9s with high wind covers and with the windjammer, with a fairy windjammer. And that seemed to do the trick. I think I recorded up to 20 miles per hour, even a bit higher than that. And it was fine. There was no problem with that. I was after the very delicate sound of sand spray, of sand just being gently blown by the wind and falling onto the crust of sand. And I succeeded in that. I managed to get some good recordings of that. But I had to be there for that because I couldn't leave the rigs out like that. And I also wanted to do unattended recording, which I managed to do with smaller rigs, with LOMs and with bumblebees. But I think that worked up to maybe 10 miles per hour. Anything over that would just overload the capsules. So I would look for dead trees. There's a lot of dead Mopani trees in the Namib. And they might have been dead for 600 years at this point because there's virtually no humidity. So they just dry. They don't succumb to moisture, to lichens or mosses or whatever. So one of the most interesting sounds I captured in Namibia was rain. Again, a very freak opportunity because it never happens. But there was a very soft rain, maybe for 5 minutes. And since I had these very tiny microphones taped to branches of this Mopani tree, the rain falling onto the branches. The branches were so taut and so dry that it sounded like a very poorly tuned marimba or xylophone. So that was fascinating to hear. And I was having breakfast the day after listening to my recordings and thought someone was playing music. What is this? What? How did I get this recording? Then obviously I realized it was the raindrops. But apart from that, whenever the wind picked up, I couldn't reuse any of those recordings. It was just basically just buffeting.
Yeah,
and
is that the chromatic rain thing you shared?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the
really
one
cool.
Yeah, the sand spray recordings you have are so incredible. It's one of my obsessions is get that sound. It's such a difficult sound to get, and
yes, that wasn't easy. No. And also, the first time I tried to do it, the wind picked up all of a sudden, and I just walked back to the vehicle, which was maybe 10-minute walk. As I got to the vehicle, I noticed that everything was covered in sand. So the sand dune was actually moving and ingesting my rigs. So I had to go back up and pick the rigs and take them back to the car, because maybe if I had waited for half an hour or for an hour, I wouldn't have found them anymore.
That's an interesting point. As you were talking about, especially in Namibia where there's no moisture, the superfine sand can be very dangerous to gear. What kind of precautions should people take as they go out into the desert to make some recordings for their gear?
That's interesting. I think for the gear it was fine. I haven't had any issues with regards to sand because I used an AquaQuest dry bag. I mean, dry bags for everything. And I just left out the microphones. And Rycoat gear is usually very good, very sturdy, and protects from some amount of humidity and from sand as well. So I haven't had any issues. I had issues with eating a lot of sand because it was impossible to avoid it, obviously. And then also getting it into my eyes. So I was going to go up this dune 45, which is probably the most famous dune in Namibia. And I was halfway up the dune, and I couldn't see where I was going because as soon as I opened my eyes, I would get like a handful of sand in them.
You need some like ski goggles, yeah.
Even so, I think sand just gets under them, or it was very difficult to do that. So I turned around and I got back because it was virtually impossible.
So did you have all of your rigs prepackaged in the dry bags before you went out and then set them?
Yep, okay. I always do that. It's just easier whenever
that's
something
what
happens.
I would do too.
I had 6 ready, so I just took one out, went out, I think I had pressed record in the vehicle just so I didn't have to open it and close it back again.
Right.
And I went out there and I had the headphones dangling because I wanted to hear as well when I put the hydrophones in, I wanted to hear what depth I needed to put the hydrophones in.
You left the headphones out of the bag, then rolled it up and you could still monitor. Okay.
So I did that. And that was pretty interesting because I was hearing the sound that was picked up by the hydrophones. I was also hearing sound being blown over my head and my face and the headphones and everything buffeting. And it was a cacophony of sounds there. But eventually I got some good sounds. I'm happy with what I managed to record there.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to know if the sand spray you're hearing is on the mics or hitting the side of your headphones.
Absolutely.
Housing. Yeah, it's hard to know.
Bethan, how did you approach wind and sand protection?
So with the wind, I actually really like recording the wind, and I love the way that it kind of tells you about your environment, and you begin to hear things. You hear the rock formations around you, and it can really draw attention to those things. I tend to look for natural windbreaks, but actually things that are making it sound particularly interesting. So like in the Mojave Desert, there are lots of what are called tafoni, which are these hollows in the granite that have been formed through different speeds of erosion, basically, with some water sort of getting into these areas, and then it sort of erodes away at a different pace from the rest of the rock. And these hollows sound, like each one sounds unique. And has a different tonality to it. It's just really interesting to listen to these things and to explore the environment through listening. I mean, they're really interesting to look at in some ways, but once you actually start hearing all the different tones that they produce, it's something, I really like to kind of basically learn about environments through listening to them. And it reveals all these different things that you don't necessarily notice if you're going to just look. Yeah, so for protecting from the wind, mostly kind of natural barriers. And I quite deliberately record the sound of the wind often. It's not often that I'm going out deliberately to record something very specific. That experience in the Atacama Desert was fairly unique in that regard for me. So I enjoy it when the wind starts to make things around me sound. I can sort of start exploring that. In terms of sand, I guess the sandiest place I've been is also the Eureka Dunes, recording that drone. And it's a challenge. The first time I went, I lost 3 preamps temporarily because I made the mistake of plugging and unplugging gear during it because I didn't know how to record it the first time I went. And so I had various different things. I had some hydrophones, some contact mics. Fortunately, I had my Soundfield microphone was left on channels 1 to 4 and channels 5 to 8 were my try things out experimentation channels. And it was just discovering in that, like, okay, this really doesn't work. Everything has to be cabled up before you go out. And she had a set of skiing glasses that have the side, like, protection. That really helped with the eye protection. And in terms of carrying the gear, it was like carrying as little as possible, making sure you're carrying water as well. That ended up being the sort of restriction of my time. And carrying the gear and water up the side of the dune is sort of tempting to not take as much, but that will always cut your recording session short. So it's just a case of balancing out what gear you're taking. So yeah, I definitely think kind of doing sort of reconnaissance first, trying things out each time so that everything is then prepared and cabled up when you go for a session to actually record.
You and George both brought hydrophones, which seems incredibly counterintuitive to me. Bringing hydrophones into the desert. Like, what's the use case? How do you deploy those?
Right. So when I went to this workshop with Chris Watson, I think it was 2014, in Norfolk, we went to the beach, recorded seals for a while. We put our hydrophones into the sand and we let the waves wash over it. And I noticed there was good material there, even when there was no seawater washing over the microphones, because there was still movement in the sand grains, and the hydrophones would pick that up. And that naturally, I made the connection there between sand and hydrophones. And I had a pair of hydrophones in Senegal in 2017, and I didn't record as much as I would have liked, but still that was a fascinating recording, and I still listen to it with great pleasure. So I have actually disconnected the word hydro from hydrophones. It's a contact microphone. It's made a bit differently, but it still picks up vibrations in mediums, in things, and in surfaces. So I'll try it on anything. It's a lot of hit and miss, but sometimes you get really beautiful recordings.
Are you manipulating the sand yourself, or you're just relying on the wind to be manipulating the sand?
Well, that's a funny story, because I initially, when the wind was high, I just put the microphones in, I gauged the depth and just let the wind play the sand. And eventually, I was looking for a singing sand dune as well. And I found one, but it wasn't windy enough, or the sand wasn't moving enough, so I had to walk around the microphones to cause these sounds. And it sounded mostly like farting or groaning, not necessarily like singing, but it was still an interesting experience. And I do have some of those recordings, but I don't think they're as good as sax, where the dune actually sings. So I think you can do both. There's nothing wrong with any approach, but it sounds more natural when you let the wind play it because it's more organic.
I'm interested, Zach, actually. Something I noticed when I was recording the Eureka tunes was that there was a kind of pattern to what happened where the wind picked up and it was pretty strong across the dunes. And then it died down and the dune started to drone. And then the drone stopped with this little pitch at the end that went up slightly as it stopped. And then there was a sort of brief pause, and then the wind would pick up. But the wind was like completely dead during the time it was droning. And it seemed like there was this interaction between them. Now, I only got 2 recordings, being once when it was droning naturally, and just have these 2 recordings, but in both of them it's the exact same pattern. I'm interested if you encountered that or what was happening.
I did not notice that. The beginning of that makes sense, that the wind kind of, basically what you're hearing is an avalanche from everything that I can gather. I mean, I'm no expert in this world. I tried to look into it and tried to see, what caused it, and read some papers that theorize and do some research about it. And they're out there if you want to do your own research. But from what I noticed and from what I could see, it's basically just a slow avalanche of sand that creates a resonance frequency with the bedrock layer possibly below. And it has to do with a lot of different factors of humidity and the silica size of the sand and the slope of the dune and the wind and all that. But yeah, it makes sense that the wind would instigate it. The wind kind of creates the beginning of the top pieces of sand, and they start going and they build up and they start knocking more pieces of sand and more, and it creates an avalanche. But the fact that that the wind is waiting for the avalanche to finish before picking up again, you're now into some kind of crunchy, everything is connected, Hakuna Matata kind of world that I'm into that too. That's cool. And no better place than the Mojave Desert for that, because that's definitely a good place for that kind of thinking to live. But it definitely feels like it is a call and response between the wind and the sand. There is that where the wind kind of calls out and the sand responds. I'm going to be honest and say that I cheated a little bit. I got a couple of the wind created ones, and then as the sun was going down and the wind was going down, I helped it a little bit, where we gave it a little bit of a push from the top and then let it take on its own, avalanche. And that thing that George was talking about too, where you you know you're on sand that has the potential to sing when it kind of gives you that like as you're walking on it, and it's a really fun sound. But in order for that sound to keep going into like a long drone, it has to have that avalanche angle and all of the factors involved with it. But I noticed it. I went out to the Mojave Kelso Dunes with a friend of mine years ago, and we were camping out there, and he actually was the one who showed me the singing aspect of it. And it was after dark, and we both just were like did a running jump at the top of the dune and then dug our feet in, and it just started going. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to come back here with Mike someday. And that's how I ended up going out to record them. But it is a very, very wild sound. And
is it sonically different between the wind producing it and you producing it?
I could not tell. I mean, there is a little bit of the front. You don't have the call and response that Bethan is speaking of the, recording the wind instigating the beginning of it. But from the ones that I heard that were naturally or organically created versus the ones that I kind of instigated myself at the top of the dune, I did not hear a difference in the drone itself. Like it was still a long, slow in, slow out drone. And like Bethan was saying, it has kind of a pitch ramp at the end as the resonance kind of picks up at the very end of it. But otherwise it was identical. Yeah, it's a pretty fun thing to record. But as far as gear, like I had my hydrophones stuck in the sand and tripods stuck in the sand, and the best thing to get is an air compressor or canned air when you get home and blow out all your cables and all of your tripod legs, because it just gets everywhere and there's no getting around it. But like you guys said, just cabling things ahead of time and using dry bags was really helpful for sure.
Yeah, something that I thought of afterwards was to use like something as a cap for the XLRs. So like, I don't know if they exist actually, but I was thinking like a cheap adapter or something that's XLR that doesn't matter if that gets the sound in it. But yeah, just kind of putting something on to the end of the cable as soon as you take it out, because it's just with the wind blowing and everything, as soon as you detach them, it's trouble.
And they get down in the pins of the XLR, and it's like impossible to clean out of there. Yeah, it sucks.
I'd approach the sand the same way I do with a lot of the other recording, because one of the things I love about deserts is the weather is so variable. You can get a snowstorm. I've been in West Texas, I've ridden my bike and it's 95, and all of a sudden there's a hailstorm. The wind can pick up, and very dynamic weather in a lot of these deserts. And so I would approach the sand protecting of the gear in the same way I would with water and a lot of things. It's just making sure that it's sealed up in dry bags, not replugging things. And yeah, I have some of those little rubber XLR plugs. Another thing that George had taught me was Nutric makes these XHG connectors that are these heavy duty XLR connectors that have a rubber seal to them, so that when those are plugged together, like sand can't get into the connecting points. So those are great for rain or snow, or also sand. It's kind of a lot of the stuff I would do for rain or snow is also applicable for sand, especially if you're going to leave rigs out for a long time. It can get buried in the dune, or like George was saying, you can get a rainstorm. You also need to be very concerned about flash floods in deserts with the gear, because I've seen a dry creek bed with a 3-foot wall of water coming down it, there was totally dry, and then there's no rain in sight, and then there's a 3-foot wall of water coming down, and it was some rainstorm like 10 miles away, and it's coming down. So you need to be very aware of water flow when you're leaving gear out with stuff like that in the deserts, because those flash floods are no joke when you're trying to protect the gear. But that's one of the more exciting things about recording in deserts is the water will do very interesting things if you're in slot canyons or creek beds, or whether if you're in some kind of oasis kind of spot where there's little spring-fed creeks, and that brings all the wildlife around. And so yeah, in general, I approach the protecting of the gear in the sand in the same way as rain or snow.
Are there precautions that people should take with regards to wildlife while they're out in the deserts?
I think it depends on where you are.
I mean, it seems like there's some coyotes, that kind of thing out there. They're not going to mess with you. It's not like bears.
Some desert areas will have black bears in them. Bears will come and sniff and mess with your gear, but I've had that happen, and then maybe they'll knock the mic over.
I love those recordings.
Yeah. Thanks.
I use Thomas's bear sniffing your mics recordings a lot. They're great.
Yeah, I had a grizzly. Like, they don't come and just sniff it. They like check it out for a full 20 minutes and grunt, but usually they'll knock the stand over and scare themselves and run away. So bears will do that. Any deer, elk, mule deer kind of animals that may or may not be in a desert or transitional kind of environment will do that. One thing I do is I take like tent stakes and I stake down the tripod legs. So then if an animal comes and pushes it, they're less likely to knock it over.
What about like insects, like millipedes and scorpions and things like that?
Anybody that lives in the desert is usually in the habit of flipping your shoes over before you put them on.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. It's like,
I feel like that's something that's important to say though for people that are going out to the desert for the first time.
yeah, that's a
The little stuff's going to get you, not the big things in the desert.
It's
It's the snakes and the scorpions or Georgia's deserts. There's giant animals too. So sorry, guys.
No, that's true. I haven't been out there, but it's between the little things, the insects and the bramble on the ground. I mean, everything's there just to stick in your feet and in your legs. And that's how it perpetuates its own life. You know, that's how the seeds get dispersed. That's how it keeps going, and that's how it finds food. So that's what's going to get you. It's not the bear coming down and getting you. But, you know, besides just wearing the right clothing for the sun, you got to wear the right clothing for the ground cover.
Which is?
Boots, you know, it's a good idea to wear boots. It's not as comfortable as wearing, you know, Birks or something more airy, but rattlesnakes out there. A boot's not going to protect you from a rattlesnake, but it's going to help a little bit if that's the case. And, you know, long jeans help as well. But yeah, that's a trick that everybody that lives in the desert will tell you is, you know, when you wake up in the tent and you go to grab your boots, flip them over and shake them out before you put them on your feet, because that's where the scorpions like to hang out at night.
Or don't put your boots outside the tent either. That's why.
Even better. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so. Speaking of snakes, when I put out a rig in the Namib, I set 2 microphones in a tree, in a Pompani tree. I had 2 8020s and I connected them. I just basically stuck the gorilla pods to the branches and left it out for 12 hours. And in the evening, when I went there was not really that much life. There was basically wind and that was about it. In the morning, there was a bit of a dawn chorus and there was some insects around. There was definitely barking geckos. So it sounded more lively.
You say barking geckos? Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah, well, they're not barking. They sound more like clicky.
Oh, that sounds cool.
Wow. That sounds
But yeah,
cool.
it sounded cool. It created a very unique atmosphere. And as I was walking, I was fascinated by this soundscape that was completely changed from what I had experienced the day previous. And I hadn't had my coffee yet, and I think I was dehydrated as well. I just walking very slowly, and all of a sudden I was just pulled back from my reverie by a violent hiss. And there was a horned adder, which some sources say is deadly, other sources say there's not enough data. But it was squirming at the bottom of the tree that I had my rigs in. So that was a bit of a conundrum, because my choices were to leave the rig there, because we had to leave in 2 hours or so.
Those are no longer your mics. So that snake owns those mics.
Yeah. Squatters' rights on the mics. Yeah.
I tried to reason with the adder, so I asked it politely. There's no reaction. There's squirming continuously there. And, you know, I'm respectful of wildlife, so I didn't want to stress it or anything. So I threw some small bits of wood in the general area, you know, not hitting it. And obviously the snake was aggravated and eventually went into a crack in the actual tree where I was supposed to go and pick up, you know, just try to climb up and pick up my rigs. I waited for half an hour, just looking around, waiting for things, and nothing happened. Went there and very, very softly, very slowly, gently took the rigs down one by one, moving very, you know, just a bit at a time. And nothing bad happened, and I was fine afterwards. But that was a bit of, that moment where from my reverie, just analyzing the sounds, just listening to everything, not looking at anything, to all my senses being like 1,000% all of a sudden, it was a huge contrast. The adrenaline was intense, I would say. Yeah.
Oh.
So, don't do as I did. Don't be immersed in the soundscape. Look around you if you're in the desert, because there's lots of things like that.
And to your point too, a thing that I've taken to heart when hiking in slot canyons or in the desert is, let alone with gear with me, is like, I absolutely don't have headphones on. Don't shut yourself off from the world around you, because that's how it tells you what to be careful for. The rattle on a rattlesnake is there because they don't want to bite you. They're trying to tell you to go away. So they're rattling to alert you when you're walking up on them. So I've had it happen a number of times with and without my dog, who's somewhat rattlesnake trained, hopefully. And so, she can understand. And I've come across a couple of snakes while on the path, and you got to be connected, and you have to be listening and not daydreaming and out, absolutely not in headphones, and not disconnected from the environment around you.
I think there's certain times, when you do that, and there's a kind of unknown level to what you're listening to, where maybe you're fairly sure that there's nothing actually lethal around. Certainly if there's animals that, like the snake, for example, George, I can completely understand that. But, what you were describing of that kind of reverie, and just when it's a kind of reverie where you're really present in the environment. So you're really listening. And I actually often sit very close to my microphones when I'm recording, quite deliberately, to engage in that process of really silencing myself and really listening to the environment, particularly because there's not this sort of bed of sound like birds singing or whatever. It's very quiet. And that process of just settling yourself to the point where you're not moving, like at all, or very minimally, and really like you kind of feel the rock underneath you, because that is what's sort of securing you. That's what your contact is with, and that's how you're staying steady and listening and having this experience of being kind of in the environment in a very intense sort of listening way that kind of allows you to really hear things differently.
How long does it take you to get into that mindset? It takes me a while. Is it 15 minutes, 45 minutes? Is it for me, it's usually like over 30 minutes or so.
Yeah. I usually find about the first 10 minutes of doing that are the sort of adjustment period where your mind's going different places, and I really do mean it when I say like you're kind of holding on to whatever surface you're sitting on, and you're getting to know that so that you don't move it, particularly if it's like a gravelly surface. And you kind of like that touch, sort of feeling that, and, understanding that whole thing is maybe 10 minutes of sort of getting into that and sort of ending up in a position where you're no longer thinking about doing that.
Are you listening through your mics, or are you just headphones off usually?
About 50-50. Often it depends what I'm recording. So, for example, if I'm recording the wind in a specific rock formation, if I'm recording something like that, where monitoring that position of the mic is particularly important, I will use the headphones. About half the time, otherwise, I will choose to use the headphones because it's part of what I'm actually experiencing being a field recordist in the environment. It's part of why I'm there, is listening through that microphone. And that experience is part of what I bring into my work that I do with these recordings. But I do enjoy just really like listening to the unmediated sound and just being in the environment as well. So it depends. There's no kind of hard and fast rule for why I would do one or the other, just how that particular environment feels, really.
Thomas and Bethan, you were both mentioning about kind of settling in and being kind of feeling at one with the environment. That's kind of a two-way street though, right? It takes a bit of time because the environment has to settle in with you as well before all the animals or insects and stuff will kind of go back to their normal routines when you enter their space.
Yeah, it takes a long time. And that's one thing I like about the deserts too, is if I'm in a forest in Alaska, like I can't sit there for an hour because a grizzly bear might come up on me and like I can't sit there safely, right? But in the desert, I got wide open space around me in most cases. And so no large wildlife's going to sneak up on you or something. So you can really sit and listen for a long period of time. And I really love doing that. And one of the things that I like to do occasionally, if I'm in a really beautiful spot, I've got something that's just captivated me. It's the wind off this ridge or some kind of slot canyons making this whistle, or I found a really cool spot. I like to actually sit and then actually record it. And then my way of making myself really, really present is that I sit and I record and then I make myself delete it after I record it, because it's like, because then I was just there and I was just listening, right? And it's actually really, really hard to make yourself do that because you got this amazing sound, but then it's like, it was just about being there in that moment and then listening through the sound telescope of the mic. And I don't know, if you've never done that, it's kind of fun, but sometimes I can't.
You're hardcore,
sometimes
Thomas.
I can't.
Masochistic.
A lot of the times I
don't know if I could do that, man.
But,
It's like that one was too good.
yeah, so it's fun listening. I mean, when I first started recording, I couldn't sit still for 5 minutes or something, but now, especially in the winter in the desert, I really love sitting and listening. I was in Utah in January, and I'm sitting there in the tent and I have my mics strung out near the tent. It's like negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit and I'm in this campsite and it's just completely dead still and there's no wind and there's like absolutely no sound for multiple hours. And it's like, it's almost like I start hearing inside my body too. It's like you just have this incredible hyper awareness that develops, or like, is that like some new tinnitus that I'm hearing in my ear because it's like so insanely quiet, or it's like you just like start hearing your intestines moving or something, or you hear something across the valley that's half a mile away. And I don't know, winters in the desert are especially neat because sometimes you'll get the bed of snow that'll be a little bit of an acoustic dampener on there as well, and it'll make the sound just kind of sing through those spaces. So the cold plus the desert is especially interesting. And then you don't have to deal with all the snakes and bugs and stuff.
Those are my favorite.
Those are not going to bother, the snake's not going to bother you in the winter, so I don't have to worry about rattlesnakes when it's 10 degrees out. So I like the winters.
I always say that the recording is just an excuse, It's an excuse to go out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm taking my mics and I'm driving 6 hours and camping 6 nights. That's what I'm there for. I'm just taking my mic so I like give myself an excuse that I'm working, quote unquote, and it just so happens that every once in a while you pull something out of it that is worth taking back and you cut into a film later on down the road. But man, the experience of sitting there and settling yourself and listening to the environment around you and not thinking about what you're going to make for dinner and not thinking about what you're going to, post to social media or whatever, you just you meditate. And that's really why I think all of us do this, because it's a way of disconnecting. And the desert's the best place for disconnecting. There's just nothing like it. It's an intensely introspective landscape. I was going to say, though, one of the problems with sitting near your mics, not necessarily in the winter, but during the hotter months in the desert, I have found is, especially after hiking up a sand dune and putting mics in, not only do you have to catch your breath so you're not huffing and puffing all over your mics, but maybe TMI, but I tend to get a lot of flies on my recordings if I'm near my mics. Because you're sweating and flies are going to be coming near you because you smell like something that they haven't smelled before. So it's one of the things I learned the hard way is like, I'm going to go stand over here so that I don't have a recording of flies.
You got to get yourself along. I haven't started using it yet, but the running Ethernet cable, you can get like a 300-foot run of that, and it's quite a bit lighter. I haven't started doing it. I know some people that have, but it's a lot less weight.
That's on my list too.
Yeah. But I don't know if that's sand friendly, because those connectors I don't think are probably going to be as good in the sand, but maybe not. You could probably wrap them with electrical tape, but that could get you further from the mic.
So for people that aren't familiar with what Thomas is talking about, they make these little Cat 5 to XLR 4-channel adapters that they're unpowered. It's just a straight copper wire connection. But you can run Cat 5 like hundreds of feet, and you can just have these little tails on either side, and it's perfect, and it'll pass fan and power in the whole thing. So it's a really nice way to move very far away from your microphones while still being physically connected.
Yeah, it just weighs a lot less. If you've already got 75 pounds of stuff in your backpack, like when I'm backpacking, I can't haul that many cables because I can't carry any more stuff, or I already have too many things strapped to the backpack. So I generally am pretty minimalist on the cables if I'm backpacking. So it's the same kind of thing. If you're going to hike up 1,000-foot dune, the weight matters a lot. So
yeah. So Bethan, I have to tell you that before we jumped on here, I jumped on your website and I was playing some of your music back, and my wife was like, "Man, that sounds like the soundtrack to the greatest movie ever." It was like,
wow, what a compliment.
Well, I was sitting there playing it, and I had it in the cans, and I was like, "Come here, listen to this." Which she was like, "Wow." It was really gorgeous stuff. You know, a lot of what we're doing when we go out and record wind and soundscapes in the desert is so that we can put them in film and TV and video games, and to use them in musical compositions as well. It's a very direct, emotional, intense connection to what the desert is, and it was really beautiful to check out. And I was just listening to it because I knew we were going to talk to you, and I'm very happy that it came across my front door there because it was very cool. So I wanted to say that to you in person. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, I find that a lot of what I'm doing is sort of thinking about these spaces that are sort of articulated by sound, and how do they make us feel? You know, how do I feel here? You know, sound is such a huge contributor to that, to our emotional response to different landscapes. And, you know, the sort of musical exploration of that, I guess, with the recordings afterwards. It's always something that kind of connection between musical experience and experience of spaces and landscapes is something that I've always been really interested in.
Yeah, highly recommended. People should check out the work that everyone here is putting out, because this is an impressive group of people here talking about this. And I really, really appreciate everyone coming on and sharing your thoughts and insights and wisdom. Deserts are extremely romantic places, much more so than they probably get credit for, and they're just fascinating. So I appreciate everyone's time coming on.
For sure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Tonebenders is produced by Timothy Muirhead, Renee Coronado, and Teresa Morrow. Theme music is by Mark Strait. Send your emails to info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter via @thetonebenders, and join Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook. Support this podcast. You can use our links when you shop with Amazon or B&H, or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click the support button. Thanks for listening.